Welcome back to Daniel Harper. If you are new here, you have arrived at exactly the right moment, because what we are about to dive into today is not just breaking news. This is a story about money, power, oil, and the kind of decisions that do not just reshape two countries. They reshape the entire world. And if you have been following this channel for a while, you already know we do not skim headlines here. We go deep. We connect the dots. We follow the strategy behind the smoke and the economics behind the explosions. So take a breath. If you are in the middle of something, I genuinely recommend setting aside the next 15 minutes or so. Because what happened in the past 24 hours, what is still unfolding right now, is one of those rare moments where the needle on the global order actually moves. And if you are not yet part of the Daniel Harper community, this is the kind of episode that tells you everything you need to know about why subscribing makes sense. Hit that button. You are exactly the audience this channel exists for. Now let us get into it. The United States military has struck Kharg Island. Let me say that again because the weight of it deserves a moment to land. The United States military has struck Kharg Island, the single most critical piece of oil export infrastructure that the Iranian state possesses. And Iran had made one thing crystal clear in the days leading up to this moment. Any attack on Kharg Island would be treated as a red line, a declaration of war. Tehran had promised that a strike on that island would cause the entire Persian Gulf to be set ablaze in retaliation. Washington crossed that line anyway. So, before we go anywhere else, let us establish exactly what Kharg Island is and why striking it is not just a military event. It is an economic earthquake with aftershocks that will be felt in every country on this planet. Kharg Island sits in the northern part of the Persian Gulf. It is not a large piece of land. It does not look like much if you are simply looking at geography. But from a financial standpoint, this island is the beating heart of the Iranian economy. Approximately 90% of all Iranian crude oil exports flow through this single island. Every dollar that funds Iran's military operations, its proxy forces scattered across the Middle East, its ballistic missile programs, its political leverage from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq, every single dollar of that traces back to the oil that departs from Kharg Island. When the United States military targeted the critical infrastructure on this island, it was not just conducting an airstrike, it was performing a financial assassination. The significance cannot be overstated. America looked at Iran and said, I am cutting off the economic artery that makes everything you do possible. I am not chasing the symptoms, I am eliminating the cause. But to understand why Washington took this extraordinary, dangerous, and enormously consequential step, a step that independent energy analysts warn could drive oil prices to $150 or even $200 per barrel, we cannot just look at the last 24 hours. We need to rewind the tape. Because the strike on Kharg Island is not where this story begins. It is where several converging storylines finally collide. Let us start with the economic trap. For weeks before the Kharg Island strike, the Washington administration had been playing a war of attrition in the skies and at sea, and it was a war it was structurally designed to lose. Every time Iran or one of its affiliated forces launched a cheap suicide drone or a low-cost ballistic missile, we are talking about projectiles that cost anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000. The United States Navy was intercepting them using SM-3 interceptor missiles. Standard Missile 3, the kind the Navy relies on to protect its ships and allied targets from inbound threats. The cost of a single SM-3 interceptor? $14 million. Let that number sit for a moment. $14 million to shoot down a $20,000 drone. That is not a sustainable defense posture. That is a slow-motion financial hemorrhage. And according to international defense reports, the United States had been burning through a significant portion of its advanced interceptor stockpile over the course of these intense defensive operations across recent months. The production line for these missiles is not fast. It cannot be rapidly scaled to compensate for depletion. These are precision systems that take time to manufacture and even longer to certify and deploy. But here is the part that truly alarmed Pentagon strategists, the part that changed the calculus entirely. Those SM-3 missiles were not originally stockpiled with the Middle East in mind. They were being held in reserve as a deterrent against a completely different potential crisis, a China-Taiwan conflict in the Pacific. The strategic logic was clear. Maintain enough advanced interceptor capability in the Pacific theater to make any Chinese military adventure against Taiwan unacceptably costly. That was the deterrence architecture. That was the Pacific insurance policy. Iran, whether through deliberate strategic calculation or through opportunistic exploitation of American commitments, was systematically draining that Pacific insurance policy using cheap drones in the Persian Gulf. The Pentagon recognized the trap. And once you see the trap clearly, the logic of the response becomes almost mathematically inevitable. You do not keep spending $14 million to neutralize a $20,000 threat. You stop playing defense, and you strike the infrastructure that makes those threats possible. You do not hunt the mosquitoes one by one. You drain the swamp. Striking Karg Island was that decision, made operational, made irreversible, made public by President Trump himself through posts on Truth Social describing the operation and its objectives. But the Karg Island strike did not emerge from only the economic asymmetry of the missile exchange. It was the culmination of a week that had already spiraled into something that historians will be analyzing for decades. Because while the drone war overhead was draining American interceptor stocks, something far more dangerous had been happening at sea. Let us go back to a Forbes article published on March 9th with a headline that reads like a strategic warning written specifically for this moment. The headline was, "Iran's real nuclear option is not a bomb, it is the Strait of Hormuz." And that headline is not hyperbole. It is geography, economics, and military doctrine compressed into a single sentence. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow waterway that sits between Iran on one side and Oman on the other. On a map, it does not look particularly imposing, but the numbers tell a completely different story. Approximately 20% of the entire world's daily oil consumption passes through this strait, millions and millions of barrels per day. The navigable corridor, the deep water channel where massive supertankers can safely transit, is just 2 miles wide for vessels traveling in each direction. 2 miles, a passage barely wider than a large urban avenue separating the global economy from an energy catastrophe. Iran knows this. Iran has always known this. And this week, Tehran decided to use it. According to reports verified by CBS News and The Guardian, the Iranian government began laying naval mines in the Strait of Hormuz with the explicit purpose of closing those waters to international shipping. And naval mines are a weapon that deserves special attention because they are not cinematic or dramatic in the way people imagine warfare to be. They are quiet. They are patient. They sit beneath the surface where no radar can reliably detect them, where satellite imagery struggles to find them. All it takes is a single civilian tanker striking one of those mines for the global insurance industry to declare the entire region uninsurable. And once that declaration is made, shipping traffic stops. Not because anyone is actively firing, not because there is a battle happening, simply because the financial risk is too catastrophic to accept. Iran was using silence as a weapon. But Tehran did not stop there. According to reports from Metro UK and multiple international news agencies, 2 massive commercial oil tankers attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz were struck by Iranian unmanned suicide boats, explosive drone boats that detonated against the hulls of both vessels, resulting in massive explosions. These were not military ships. These were commercial tankers carrying oil that the global economy depends on. And after those attacks, the Iranian regime delivered its message to the world with cold, deliberate confidence. Oil prices will rise to $200 a barrel. Brace yourselves. Now let me pause here and make sure we really understand what that threat means, because it is easy to hear the number $200 per barrel and think of it as a gas station problem. It is not. It is civilizational. When oil reaches $150 or $200 a barrel, the damage is not contained to fuel prices. The ripple effect moves through the entire fabric of the modern economy. Shipping costs explode, and everything you consume, food, clothing, electronics, medicine, building materials, travels through supply chains that depend entirely on fuel to function. When fuel becomes catastrophically expensive, every single product in every single store becomes more expensive. Food prices do not just increase modestly, they surge. Heating costs in Europe and North America, already strained by years of energy insecurity, become unmanageable for millions of households. Airlines cancel routes or begin passing costs directly to passengers in ways that price ordinary people out of travel entirely. Western economies, many of which were still navigating the after effects of years of inflationary pressure, would be looking at a serious recession, not a slowdown, a contraction, and it would not stop at Western economies. Japan depends on Gulf oil. South Korea depends on Gulf oil. China, the world's largest oil importer, draws enormous quantities of its energy from tankers that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. If that strait closes, the industrial engine of Asia begins to slow down. And when Asia slows, global supply chains freeze, global demand collapses, and unemployment spreads across every continent. This is what Tehran was holding over the world's head. This is the financial weapon of mass destruction the Iranian regime deployed not through any single dramatic act, but through the methodical threat of strangulation. Iran was not just fighting a war, it was holding the global economy hostage and daring the United States to pay the ransom. That is the context in which Washington's decision must be understood. Iran was not simply attacking military assets. It was threatening to collapse the economic foundations of the modern world. Striking back at the economic source of that threat was not just justifiable, it was arguably the only coherent strategic response available. Before the Karg Island strike, however, America had already taken direct military action at sea, and the scale of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz earlier this week is something that deserves to be told slowly and carefully, because the numbers are staggering. According to military briefings reported by both Euronews and NBC News, the United States military confirmed it had destroyed 16 Iranian naval vessels. 16 ships. These were not large warships. They were the mine-laying craft and fast attack boats operated by the naval branch of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the units responsible for seeding the Strait of Hormuz with mines and for carrying out attacks on commercial shipping. American warships and attack helicopters systematically hunted these vessels and eliminated them. 16 is not a skirmish number. 16 is not a warning shot. 16 ships destroyed is a message delivered in the clearest possible language. The United States is prepared to eliminate your operational naval capability in this theater entirely, if that is what it takes to keep these waters open. But here is the strategic complexity that prevented even 16 destroyed vessels from being a complete solution. Iran's naval doctrine in the Strait does not rely on large, powerful ships that can be identified and tracked easily. It relies on what military analysts call swarm tactics. Dozens, in some cases 40 or more, of small, fast, radar-evasive, explosives-laden speedboats deployed simultaneously against a target. When a swarm of that size converges, defensive systems struggle to prioritize threats fast enough to neutralize all of them. It is not about the capability of any individual boat. It is about overwhelming the defender's reaction capacity through sheer volume and speed. Sinking 16 vessels was a tactical success, but in a body of water as large and complex as the Persian Gulf, with Iran's ability to deploy small craft quickly, the threat was not permanently eliminated by naval action alone. To truly break the cycle, you have to attack the economic engine that funds, fuels, arms, and sustains those boats. And that engine, that economic artery, runs through Karg Island. At the same time as these naval engagements were being fought, the Pentagon was executing a second critical strategic move, one that signals exactly how seriously Washington is taking the potential for this conflict to expand. Jointly reported by the Wall Street Journal and Forbes, the United States deployed a Marine Expeditionary Unit, an MEU, directly into the Persian Gulf theater. And for those unfamiliar with what an MEU actually represents in terms of military capability, let me be specific about this because it matters enormously for understanding what the United States is preparing for. An MEU is not a show of force. It is not a diplomatic gesture delivered via warship. An MEU is a self-contained, fully operational floating army. It carries its own organic air power in the form of helicopters and vertical takeoff and landing jet aircraft. It carries armored ground vehicles. It carries its own artillery, its own logistics, its own command and communications infrastructure, and thousands of fully combat-equipped Marines who can be inserted onto a hostile shore at a moment's notice. The operational doctrine of an MEU is direct and unambiguous. Deploy, breach, secure the objective. These forces exist specifically to project American military power into places where a crisis requires a physical American presence on the ground. So what is the MEU being deployed to do? The consensus among military analysts is that a full ground invasion of Iran is not the current objective. The immediate mission set is threefold. First, to deter any Iranian attempt to expand the conflict into ground-based engagements. Second, to provide direct support and force protection for mine-clearing operations in the Strait of Hormuz, because every mine in that water represents a live threat to global shipping and must be found and neutralized. Third, and perhaps most visibly symbolic, to station American military personnel physically aboard commercial vessels transiting the strait, serving as a direct deterrent against further drone boat attacks. What the MEU deployment tells you, if you read it correctly, is not what is happening today. It tells you what Washington is preparing for tomorrow. The United States is not assuming Iran absorbs the Karg Island strike quietly. The United States is postured, positioned, and ready for an escalating response. And now we arrive at the most important and most uncertain dimension of everything we have covered today. What does Iran do next? Because that is the question every strategist, every energy trader, every diplomat, and every world leader is trying to answer right now. And there is no clean, comfortable answer. The honest assessment of Iran's strategic position following the Karg Island strike is this: Tehran is in a more constrained situation than it has been in years, but it is also in a more dangerous one. Its primary economic asset, the oil export infrastructure that funds everything it does, has just been directly targeted. Its fast attack naval capability in the Strait has been devastated with 16 vessels destroyed. Its mine-laying campaign is being actively countered. A fully capable American expeditionary force is parked in the region, and every major power on the planet, including China and Russia, both of which have deep economic interests in stable oil prices, is watching to see what Tehran does next. Iran's biggest weapon was always the threat of economic pain, the threat that it could push oil prices to catastrophic levels and make Western governments choose between military escalation and economic self-destruction. But the United States just demonstrated that it is willing to absorb the economic consequences of the oil price spike in order to neutralize that threat at its source. That changes the calculus for Tehran fundamentally. The escalation ladder is still in front of both parties. Both sides have already climbed several rungs. The question now, the question that will define the next chapter of this crisis, is whether either side has the strategic discipline and the political courage to stop climbing before the entire structure collapses. Because in geopolitics, as in physics, every action generates a reaction. And when both sides are committed to not being the one that blinks, the ladder gets very tall, very fast. Before I wrap up, here is something I want you to genuinely think about, and then answer in the comments. I read every comment on this channel, every single one. The Daniel Harper community has consistently brought analysis into these comment sections that has genuinely sharpened my own thinking, and I mean that without any exaggeration. So these are not throwaway questions. I actually want to know what you think. Here's the first question. Do you believe the United States strike on Karg Island was the right strategic move? Was it a calculated masterstroke? A decision to go directly at the economic root of the problem rather than continuing to bleed out on expensive missile defenses? Or was it a dangerous miscalculation that has just handed Tehran every justification it needs to escalate beyond anything we have seen so far, potentially drawing Russia, China, and every regional power into a conflict with no clear ceiling? And here is the second question. How do you think the disruption to the Strait of Hormuz is going to affect oil prices in the coming weeks? And more specifically, how would a $150 or $200 barrel of oil actually impact your life, your country, your cost of living? Because this is not an abstract geopolitical number. It lands on real people in real ways, and I want to hear from you about what that looks like where you are. Drop your answers in the comments. That is where the real conversation happens on this channel. And if you have not already subscribed to Daniel Harper, now is the moment. Not as a favor to me, but because this story is not finished. What comes next matters enormously, and I will be here to break it down every step of the way. If you want to stay ahead of it, be here for the next one. The fires on Karg Island are still burning. The Strait of Hormuz is still contested. The escalation ladder is still standing, and the global economy is holding its breath. This is Daniel Harper. Stay sharp, stay informed, and I will see you in the next one.